Hi everyone, this is Rebecca from ChemKnits, and in today's dyeing experiment I am going to dip dye 100 grams of yarn into 3 different formulations of black food coloring. 3.5 years ago I did do a breaking black dyeing video where I compared McCormick's black liquid food coloring to Wilton's black icing color. And that video showed us that the icing color broke into kind of a brilliant blue and pink, and the McCormick's black broke into some colors, but the contrast was not as extreme as it was with the Wilton's black. Well, around a year or so, I ordered more Wilton's black, and I realized that they changed the formulation of their black food coloring. So the newer Wilton's black food coloring has a formulation which is much closer to the McCormick's food coloring. So here, so I can show you, the McCormick's liquid food coloring, and I mean this bottle is old, so they possibly could have changed it, contains red number 40, blue number 1, and yellow number 5. The old Wilton's food coloring contained blue number 1, red number 3, and both yellow 5 and 6. And I think that it is the red number 3 that gives the dramatic results with the breaking violet. I'll show you that formulation in a minute. The new Wilton's violet food coloring contains blue 1 and 2, red number 40, and yellow number 5. So what I'm curious to see today is if the change from red number 3 to red number 40 really makes a big difference in the breaking. And I'm choosing to dip dye the yarn because I really want to exaggerate the breaking of colors, whereas last time I think some of the breaking was a little more subtle. Now Wilton's violet food coloring contains red number 3 and blue number 1. And so both of those colors were in the original Wilton's black, which is why I think that you got some similar breakability. But we will see what happens. In each of these cups back here I have half a cup of water, and I am doing this just to mix the dyes in, I guess, some equivalent containers so that way we can see what the concentrated dyes look like before I add them into the pots, which I've got 3 different pots, so things will look a little different inside there. For the Wilton food colorings, I am going to use the extremely scientifically accurate back of the fork method for adding the dye. And wow, you see I've not used a lot of my Wilton's black, but I'm taking just this fork and, okay, that's a lot of dye. Coating it up, and this one is the old Wilton, which we are going to be referring to as number 2, and I haven't even opened up this newer Wilton's black yet. I had a panic moment when I wondered if they had changed the formulation of Wilton's violet, but they haven't, and so interesting. I haven't really mix these much, but initially when I added them, the old Wilton's almost had a green tinge to it, and the newer one looked a little pink at first. So, I mean, clearly they both look very, very dark right now, but actually even on here, this one looks slightly greener. And so for the liquid food coloring, there's still a lot of dye left on the forks, but we want to try to get it around as dark as those other ones. So 4, 5. Oh, maybe that was 11. So maybe I've got 31 drops of the liquid McCormick's food coloring in container number 1, and kind of cleaning up a little bit of a mess, la la la. And then alright, so in container number 1, I think I have 31 drops of the McCormick's black food coloring. In cup number 2, I have a nice little forkful of the old of the old Wilton's black that contains red number 3. And then in the number 3, I have the new Wilton's black that contains red number 40. Okay, I am now setting up and heating up 3 different dye baths. In each of these pots, I have 8 cups of water. And I am going to add approximately 3 tablespoons of white vinegar to each pot. You know, if I really wanted a real comparison, I could have done this in the same pot one after the other, but I'm afraid that I might lose track over which is which a lot faster. 1, 2, 3. You can see that it's not completely accurate. This isn't the this is more of a qualitative comparison versus a quantitative comparison. I've added 3 tablespoons of vinegar to each of these dye baths, and now I am going to add the dyes and then heat things up. My plan is to go 1 McCormick's, 2 old Wilton's, 3 new Wilton's. So I'm now going to add the dye to each of the containers as I'm heating it up. So that brings the total volume in each pot to just over 8.5 cups. This one's going to be a tiny bit tight maybe with the yarn, but we'll see. So that was the McCormick's, number 1. And number 2, we've got the old Wilton's. Stir that up. And then in number 3, we've got the new Wilton's. That does seem a bit redder to me. That's interesting. Yeah, and even the residual dye in these containers looks a little different to me. Now that the dye is in the pots, we are going to let these heat up and bring them to a simmer. So then we can dip dye the yarn in them one at a time. I have 300 grams of worsted weight 100% wool yarn. This is KnitPicks Bare Wool of the Andes worsted yarn. I have this pre-soaking in just plain water. You only need to pre-soak the yarn 20 or 30 minutes. You want the fibers to be saturated so that way they can take the dye a bit easier than if it were dry. I happen to have soaked these overnight, which is not necessary. 20 to 30 minutes would be totally sufficient. But I will gently squeeze out most of this water before we start dip dyeing because we don't want the yarn to already be dripping when we start. Number 1 is now boiling, so we are going to start dip dyeing the damp yarn into it. You can see the yarn, there's no water dripping, so I wrung most of that out. And I have some kitchen tongs on hand for when I get close to the end. But the water, you can see, is at a low boil, and I'm just going to reduce the heat a tiny bit more. And let's start dipping. So initially you can see that the color is kind of almost like a deep reddish, but slowly, kind of like doing a candle, I'm just going to slowly add more and more yarn. I know that when I'm doing this with Wilton's Violet, kind of all of a sudden you see, oh, all the red is gone. But yeah, this, ooh, look, did you see, I don't know if you noticed that when I pulled that up, we started to see a little bit of blue. The yarn gets pretty heavy. You see how, you know, we're suddenly seeing less of the red. I'm going to let I'm going to stay in kind of this region for a little bit. You don't want the yarn to stretch too much, but the bottom part is getting pretty dark, and there's still a lot of dye in the pot. But yeah, see, we're getting some blue. There's definitely some breaking going on here. And so this is going to be a really, really fun colorway. And so you have a choice when you're dip dyeing the yarn, because you can always add it to the pot at the very end and then just kind of let it, alright, and you want to be careful that you don't do that. You can leave it in the pot at the end and let, you know, everything soak up, or, this is getting really heavy, or I have a plate behind the pot, so after I do the last little bit, I will take this out and set it aside. But you can, I don't know if you can see the water, but there's still a lot of dye in the pot. And I'm not sure if the other end is getting anywhere near black. Maybe I need a bowl. See, that's turning blue. Alright, I'm gonna set that out for a second and get a bowl instead, because this is pretty wet and I don't want to create a massive mess. But certainly you can see that you can break even McCormick's black. Okay, now since I'm getting to the end and I don't want to dye myself, I'm going to use the tongs. And I'd like there to be some blue at this end. And as always with 100, this is not a superwash yarn, and so I don't want I don't want to felt it, so you do want to be careful with the agitating, but I am trying to get some more. I don't want all the blue to wash out, and so that's why I'm hoping for it to get a bit darker, and then we'll get some blue along the rest of it. But I'm very excited to see what this will look like when it dries. But first it'll have to cool and I'll need to wash it. So, alright, I think I'm going to take this out. But see, the water runoff is blue, so most of the red that is in this food coloring has absorbed to the fiber, and then we've got this cool blue at the end. And then there is color left in the pot. Let's see if I can find a... The problem with using a dark pot is that it makes it hard for you to see the color that's left. And so all that's left is the blue. So the McCormick's food coloring has the red 40 in it, which isn't, I guess, as brilliant as the red number 3. Well, we'll see in a second. But you know, we do get some really cool separation, and so you still can see some breaking. And so some amount of this is certainly just, you know, a gradient. You would get a gradient from any dip dyeing, but there's no question that this has more red in it than the end does. It's time for number 2, which is the old Wilton that contains the red number 3. And I need to squeeze out a tiny bit more water from my yarn. And this is the same yarn base, and has the same amount of vinegar. The dye itself there might be a little less, but let's start dipping. And so you can see that this looks a lot bluer right from the start. Now I will note that there is some of the red dyes are crashing out, and you can see that around the edges of the pot. And I used to think that that was because of the amount of vinegar that I was using, but I realized that especially in some of the older dyes there are just particulates, and so that does wash out. But now you see we're already transitioning from the red into this blue, and the transition to blue happened a lot faster. So I think that maybe the red might bind, the red number 3 might bind a lot faster than the blue. Because some people have asked me about like breaking orange and yellow, and you know what you see down there, it's reddish, but it's not bright red, because I think that the yellow might bind pretty quickly as well. And this is getting a little hot, so I'm going to switch over to the tongs. Oops, let's get everything. Oh no, everything dipped. I'm trying to hold on. Oops. Alright, I'm just going to have to let go and poke that down. It is a little difficult to get an accurate comparison between brands when one is a liquid, and I suppose I could look up, like, you know, approximately the difference between the icing color and the liquid drops, but there's no question that this breaks and that you get some really, really cool colors. We'll just have to see how the new Wilton compares to the old one. And I don't want to leave this in the pot too long, because you can see maybe right there, there's like a twinge of pink because of some of the particulates. So I'm now going to remove this one, and you could certainly leave it in the pot until the dye runs clear, but I don't want, you know, so here you can see some pink towards the end where some of the particulates were, but I don't want to leave this in and have that disrupt too much of what we get. But so here is the old Wilton Broken Black. And I just wanted to comment that you can see that there is a lot of blue remaining in the pot. So if we had left the yarn in the pot longer, then we would have seen, we would get more blue kind of all over the yarn. It's time to dye the new formulation of Wilton's Black. So you can see kind of initially that this is looking a lot more like the McCormick's Black, in that, you know, before we saw the red strike really, really fast, and so this is taking a lot longer to just go straight to blue. And maybe that's why they changed it, because they could get, by using red number 40, they could get a more consistent coloration. Now, I've been asked about dyeing a true black using food coloring, and I don't have a good answer for you on that. I think that if you really want a true black versus, you know, a dark brown or something, that you might want to look into commercial food colorings. Not commercial food colorings, I'm sorry, commercial dyes. I think food coloring is not going to cut it. Ooh. Not sure if you can see, but what... Okay, so I guess we are at a blue stage now, but maybe because of the reflection of the yarn from up here, it almost looks purple. And I am now going to swap to my handy dandy tongs. So, is there still breaking? Absolutely. There's no question that you can still, and I'm just going to put this all in. I'm noticing less particles, but again, this food coloring is a lot newer. I've purchased this Wilton's food coloring in the last probably 2 years or so, and the other one I probably purchased back when I first started dyeing. So, you know, the other one's at least 5 years old. I wish that they had dates on them. That would be handy. They have numbers, but not really dates. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I've tried like adding like Wilton's Violet, and I'll give a close-up of, oh, actually, you can still see on the screen. You can see the ring of the red. And I used to think it was red crashing out because of too much vinegar, but you can see the particles in the old Wilton's kind of even on the glass. I think that it might just be something with the older dye. I'm actually going to turn off the heat and remove. You can see that we've still got some blue in the water, but most of it is most of the dye is in the yarn. And arrange this into a bowl, and so it's still a gorgeous yarn. I mean, look at that. We've got this deep color that kind of goes into a blue, and so this would be really, really fun to knit up. But now I need to let all these cool, and then we can wash the fibers and let them dry. But so for now, we can definitely say you can break all three of these formulations. You get, yeah, I think that you get more, the red will strike faster in the old Wilton's formulation, but even with red number 40, you can still get some awesome color breaking. The yarns have cooled and it's just about time to wash them, but they're so pretty in the bowls that I just wanted to give you a peek before, you know, the final like finished dry reveal. So this is the yarn that we dyed using McCormick's black, and I would say that it looks right now to be the brownest of the three. And then this is the old Wilton's Violet, which definitely has the most blue in it. The red struck the yarn really first, and we got a lot of breaking in the bottom edge, or like the edge that was in the dye first. Whereas we have this really, in the newer Wilton's Violet, we have this really more even gradient, it looks like, from this deep purple to this blue. So it's really gorgeous, and I'm curious to compare it to the Wilton's Violet gradient that I've done to see if it's much more muted overall, and to compare that. I'm filling my wash basin with lukewarm water, and I'm going to add just some standard dish soap to it to make a wash bath for the yarn. The goal now will be to gently rinse the yarn, since it is not super washed, until the water runs completely clear. And I'm just putting all three skeins of yarn in at the same time. They have cooled completely at this point. And I think, as you can see, there's very, very little runoff of color. I mean, it's a little hard to see with the suds, and the water is slightly, maybe a little bit of blue is coming out. It's a little hard to know because the water was slightly green from the dish soap, but you know, I'm gonna rinse this, I'll remove it, change out the water a few times until all the soap is gone and the water runs clear. And then I will hang them to dry and come back and talk about how this experiment went. Here are the three finished yarn gradients that we created by breaking different formulations of black food coloring. The first one we did was we used McCormick's black food coloring, which contains red number 40, blue number 1, and yellow number 5. We then dip dyed yarn into the old Wilton's black formulation that contained blue number 1, red number 3, and yellow number 5 and 6. And then finally we used Wilton's new formulation, which is much similar to the McCormick's in that it has red number 40, yellow number 5, and blue number 1, but the Wilton's formulation also contains some blue number 2. In all cases, we were absolutely able to see stunning breaking. Whether it's going from a brown to a blue, or kind of a mauve-y purple to a blue, or even almost like a green to a blue, we got a gradient that is more than just a depth of tone change. It's really the colors breaking, and the red dyes are binding to the fiber faster than the blue, which is what, in each case, the last yarn to go into the pot were these lightest blue sections. And I think after doing this, I'm really excited with the new formulation of Wilton's black. I think that these colors are absolutely stunning, and you get a more consistent gradient, because I think just from my observation, the red 40 strikes slower than the red number 3. If I zoom in and we look at this darker section on the old formulation that has the red number 3, you can see these patches of red around here. And that's because even using damp yarn, the red number 3 strikes and binds to the fiber so fast that you end up with mottling breaking immediately. This is something that we observe, without heat when we speckle dye with Wilton's violet food coloring, because you can see color separation from just adding a dot of food coloring onto yarn, because that's just how quickly that red number 3 binds to it. And then looking at the difference between the McCormick and the Wiltons, I don't know how much of this is a difference in the formulation and that they have different blues, or if it is really just a concentration of dye difference. I haven't done a close equivalency test to how many drops of the liquid McCormick's food coloring are equivalent to what volume of the Wilton's food coloring. And so the qualitative difference of it being more brown versus more purple is something that, maybe we would see a difference if we added less food coloring here. I'm not entirely sure. I do know that they're both beautiful, consistent gradients, and the blues that you get at the center are fairly similar, and so it's something that will be a lot of fun to play around with now and in the future. But it's also worth checking your ingredient list to see what you've got. This Wilton's black that I used in this skein is really, really old, and the one from this one is only a couple years old. So you might not even find this older formulation unless you have dye that has been in your kitchen for a long time. But it is really fun to play around with, and I highly recommend it. And finally, I wanted to just share a yarn that I dyed in dip dyeing with Wilton's Violet, just so that way you can see a comparison between the colors that we get from dip dyeing black food coloring versus the Wilton's Violet food coloring. All are beautiful, but the colors that we get from Wilton's black are a bit more muted versus the vibrancy we get of the much more red from the Wilton's Violet. I hope that you enjoyed this side-by-side comparison of some different formulations of black food coloring and the colors that they break into. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and make sure that you subscribe to this channel so that way you can see when I add new videos. Thank you for watching and happy dyeing!